All right, let's start and people will keep on joining. Hello, everyone. Salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event. Today's topic is the battle for the soul of Islam. And the speaker is a very well-known or internationally known journalist, Dr. James M. Dorsey. He has been a foreign correspondent and academic, foreign correspondent to many world media. And the formal introduction will be given by Professor Greg Barton, who is from the Deakin University, Australia, professor in global Islamic politics. Concluding remarks will be given by Professor Mohammed Fadel, who is a professor at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Law, Canada. And all three have the background on Islam, violence, its politics. And let's hear what the formal, Professor Greg Barton has to say about James Dorsey and the topic. Welcome you all.
Thank you very much, Razi. What do I have to say about James Dorsey? Well, there's a lot to say, and there's not enough time to say it. So this is going to be a very brief and enigmatic introduction, which is, it is supposed to be brief. The request was not to make it enigmatic, but it's about James Dorsey, so of course it's enigmatic. This is in particular, this discussion tonight, James will unpack the background to it, but it's about his recent book, The Battle for the Soul of Islam, which is an overnight success. It's taken him, I don't know, maybe 12 months to write, but it's been 50 years in the making. It's the work of a lifetime, not that the book has been literally written for a lifetime, but the lifetime is reflected in the book. And if you know anything about James's background and his work, one of his projects, and indeed a previous book, was The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer, which was most certainly about the Middle East, and it was certainly about a turbulent world, but it wasn't just or even primarily about soccer. It was soccer was just a device, an entree to discuss the Middle East, but its people and its politics, its leaders and its personalities, and the complex intermeshing dynamics of why things happened and played out in everyday life in something like soccer. But even that was not just about politics. The question of Islam was always there, not because James makes it central or has made it central in previous work he's done as something that explains everything, but because it is central to the fact that it's there in every way and works at multiple levels. So what James has done with this book, The Battle for the Soul of Islam, is make a really interesting comparison with the way Islam is understood and applied in a political context in the Middle East, and the way it's applied in Southeast Asia. Specifically, the book, the sort of key states in focus are Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Indonesia, but then surrounding states come into play. So there's a look at Islam in the heartland and Islam in the periphery. And this is another thing that's remarkable at James, because he'll tell you his background. I'm not going to attempt to do it now, but he's Middle East through and through, and he's the religions of Abraham through and through in complex and varied and multiple ways. I think it's probably fair to say, James, and James, you correct me, James is not conventionally religious, or he might say not religious at all, and yet religion dominates his life.
That's indeed
and fascinates
true.
him. He's, I don't know, James, you would describe yourself, but you might describe yourself as a secular materialist. But that would suggest that you didn't think religion was important, and specifically that Islam wasn't important and that ideas weren't important. So in this book, as the title suggests, the ideas involved in discussions and application about Islam are most certainly important. But it is a book about politics, and it is a book looking at the sort of realpolitik of things. But it doesn't dismiss the fact that religion is important to people and that the ideas of religion is important to people. So The choice of comparison partly reflects, well, it's come out of, it's not simply a product of, but it comes out of James's life and work, having moved from the Middle East to Southeast Asia and having increasingly become familiar with developments in Indonesia. And in Indonesia, he's focusing particularly on the world's largest Islamic civil society movement, or some people might say Islamically inspired Islamic civil society movement, Nahdlatul Ulama, the awakening of the ulama, an organization that began in 1926, today has 90 million members, and as James correctly says, is not only the world's largest but most moderate Islamic civil society movement. It's a remarkable thing that James has come to know very well, and it's something that very few people who know the Middle East and focus on Middle Eastern Islam, as well as James, understand with a sort of equal level of insight. So I would put it to you, it's very hard to find scholars working on Islam in the Arab world who have a deep understanding of and interest in Islam, particularly in Southeast Asia, and particularly in Indonesia. There are a few scholars who come to mind, but not many. And that makes this book a particularly interesting focus. That's not the reason the book is the way it is. The reason the book is the way it is, I mean, it's only possible because of this background and interest of James, but it's the way it is because this is a really important comparison, because you've got a cutting edge, geographically peripheral element of the Muslim world that is producing new and vibrant thought. And you've got a historical center that is full of hubris and a sense of entitlement that has struggled with vibrant thought. And the reason isn't really to do with Islam per se, it's to do with politics, which of course makes sense because it's James Dorsey and it's his life's work. But that's not to say that unpacking Islam is not important. So I think it's a very timely book. I mean, this is a timely discussion we're having. I don't need to tell you how tragic it is to think of the events of the past 12 months. You know that very well. It's such a difficult and sad situation, and the ideas that James discusses in the book, reflect on some of the developments we're concerned about at the moment. They don't explain it all, but we can't understand what's happening in the broader Muslim world if we don't understand the ideas that James is looking at in his book. So it's a really timely. I mean, the book was in work well before this developments the last 12 months, but it's very timely that it's come out now, and it's very timely that we're having this discussion this weekend. I wish I could stick around for the 3 hours, but it's gone past 1 a.m. here in Melbourne, and I've got to head to the airport in 12 hours time and fly to Indonesia, which is nice for me, but it means I better get back to bed. I wish I could join you for the whole discussion, because this is a really fascinating and provocative, but quite lyrically beautiful book. So it's not provocative in the sense of somebody taking cheap shots. It's somebody constantly provoking you with deep insights and thoughts that challenge what you thought you knew. That's enough of enigmatic introduction from me, because this is going to be quite a delight to unpack both this book, but also how James came to write it, and why he came to the strong, but I think very well justified convictions that he has, that expresses in this book. So thank you very much. And congratulations, James.
Thank you. Let me start off by, first of all, thanking Raz for this gracious invitation. I'm honored by it, and hope that this proves to be a fruitful discussion. I'm certainly humbled by Greg's introduction. That was very gracious. The one remark, just to amplify on it, is to say that, yes, I mean, I'm not so much probably a secular materialist as I would describe myself as an atheist. But having said that, and maybe even in my older age, more militantly an atheist, but having said that, I do recognize the importance of religion and the role that religion plays. Whether or not that plays in my life that way is neither here nor there. and the importance that it plays certainly in the Muslim world, as well as in the Middle East as such, with the non-Muslim segments of the region's population. Just very briefly, this book really came out of, on the one hand, having dealt with Islam, particularly as a political player in the Middle East for many years, but also having, I mean, my initial years or exposure to Indonesia go back to the 1970s. And then really having gone back to Indonesia about a decade ago, roughly, out of curiosity to explore Nahdlatul Ulama, and being fascinated by what I found and the comparison indeed, particularly in the post 9/11 period, but we'll come to discuss that in terms of defining what is moderate Islam. Before launching into the substance of all of this, I also really want to thank Mohammed for joining us. Mohammed is not only one of the world's foremost Islamic legal scholars, he also will probably bring an interesting perspective to all of this, because he just returned from a month in Indonesia, as he told me in an email a little while ago, and was fascinated by what he found. But I'm sure that he'll speak to that. Let me start off by taking you back in time, back a century ago, to 1924. At the time, Jordanian ruler King Abdullah I, the current King Abdullah's great-grandfather, was convinced that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the visionary carved modern Turkey out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, had handed him the leadership of the Muslim world on a silver platter, with the abolishment of the Caliphate by the newly appointed Turkish parliament. The Abdullahs are Hashemites, who claim to be descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, and at times governed.
Sorry, your voice is breaking somehow.
Sorry?
It was very smooth initially, but your voice is breaking. I mean, somehow the speaker or the sound is breaking. Sorry, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Now it is.
Is it still breaking?
No.
Okay.
So
It's not?
this is fine, but somehow either you were more into it or something happened.
Huh. Okay. Let me see if I can reposition, and if that's better. Give me a second, okay?
Sorry for that.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me better now?
Well,
Can you hear me better now?
yeah, it is still breaking. It is echoing.
What I should do is, let me just close down and reconnect, okay?
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'll do that.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Hold on.
Oh.
Okay.
Sometimes in situations like this, if everybody turns off their video, that can save bandwidth too.
Most have turned it off.
Is he in Singapore?
He is right now in Thailand.
Oh, he's in Thailand.
He was quite fine. He was talking and quite smoothly. Everything was fine.
Okay.
And suddenly,
I don't know how good the internet connection is in Thailand.
Oh, voila. What can you say? Let's see, where is he? He's not yet connected. Sorry for all that. But, he must be just joining any minute. What happened?
He's here.
Is there, just make him and then.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, is that better?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so let me start from the top again. As I was mentioning, Jordanian ruler King Abdullah I, the current King Abdullah's great grandfather, was convinced that Mustafa came
No, we
out
have the
of
same
Turk,
issue.
the visionary. Sorry,
We
hello?
still have the same issue. It's breaking up for me at least.
It's breaking up still.
Would you want to
Okay.
try turning off a camera and see whether that improves? Just to see.
Sure.
Although that's not an
Sure.
ideal setup, but
Okay, is this? No, I realize that, but is that any better,
it is.
or is it still? It's okay. It's better.
Yes.
Okay, well, let me give this another try. Jordanian ruler King Abdullah I, the current King Abdullah's great-grandfather, was convinced that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the visionary who carved modern Turkey out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, had handed him the leadership of the Muslim world on a silver platter, with the abolishment of the caliphate by the newly appointed Turkish parliament. The Abdullahs are Hashemites who claim to be descendants of the Prophet Muhammad and at times governed the holy city of Mecca. After almost 500 years of Ottoman leadership, colonial rule, if you will, abolishing the caliphate created a vacuum. Abdullah I was euphoric. He couldn't believe his luck. After almost 500 years of imperial Ottoman leadership, abolishing the caliphate created a vacuum, and Abdullah was inclined to send Ataturk a congratulatory telegram. He told the Manchester Guardian that the caliphate is an Arab institution. The Prophet was an Arab. The Quran is in Arabic. The holy places are in Arabia, and the caliph should be an Arab of the tribe of Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet. The caliphate had returned to Arabia in Abdullah's mind. The fact of the matter is that it didn't. A century later, it is not the caliphate that Middle Eastern and Asian Muslim powerhouses are fighting about, despite efforts by religious militants and jihadists like the Islamic State to establish a credible caliphate. Today, Middle Eastern and Asian Muslim powerhouses compete for religious soft power, the ability to define what Islam stands for in the 21st century, and geopolitical influence. A core element of that competition is whether Islamic law needs to be reformed to eliminate problematic and outdated concepts, including whether the concept of a caliphate should be maintained in Muslim religious law. The significance of this battle lies in what is at stake. The battle will determine which Muslim majority country or countries will be recognized as leaders of the Islamic world, and the degree to which moderate Islam incorporates the notion of a nation state as opposed to the caliphate, and principles of tolerance, pluralism, gender equality, and human rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The major competitors fall into two broad categories. Proponents of a state-controlled form of Islam, whose principles are defined by the political needs of an authoritarian or autocratic state, and advocates of an interpretation of the faith that is defined by civil society, embraces principles of humanitarianism, pluralism, human rights, and involves legal recontextualization and/or reform of Islam to address problematic and discriminatory notions. It is what I described in my just published book as a battle for the soul of Islam. The battle pits rival Middle Eastern and Asian powers against one another. The primary players are Saudi Arabia, home to Islam's holiest cities. The United Arab Emirates, like Saudi Arabia, promulgators of a militantly authoritarian interpretation of Islam. And Indonesia, which promotes an independent humanitarian, and pluralistic notion of Islam that reaches out to other faiths as well as non-Muslim center-right forces across the globe. The two Gulf states and Indonesia are widely viewed as proponents of an interpretation of Islam that is moderate, at least in social terms, as opposed to Turkey and Iran, who represent socially more conservative and politically more militant expressions of the faith. Other players, like Qatar and Morocco, have either dropped out of the race or focus on regional rather than global influence. In the ultimate analysis, no clear winner may emerge from this battle. Yet the course of the complex religious and geopolitical rivalry could determine the degree to which Islam will be defined by one or more competing stripes of ultra-conservatism or statist forms of the faith that preach absolute obedience to the ruler and reduce religious establishments to pawns of the state. These players seek to perpetuate what historian Ahmed Kuru calls the alliance between Muslim religious scholars, the ulama, and the state, as opposed to a truly more tolerant and pluralistic interpretation of one of the three Abrahamic religions. Moreover, the outcome of this battle is likely to play a significant role in determining the prospects for peace and security, not only in the vast region extending from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Philippines, but also in Europe and the United States. Implicit in the rivalry is a broader debate across the Muslim world that goes to the heart of the relationship between the state and religion. What role the state, if at all, should play in the enforcement of religious morals, and the place of religion in education, judicial systems, and politics. Increasingly, the lines dividing the state and religion become more blurred, the more autocratic a political system is. The history of the quest for Muslim religious soft and geopolitical power tells the story of an increasingly competitive struggle with the staggered entry of new players. Initially, the Saudis, with Egyptian, Pakistani, and a degree of West African input, had the playing field in the 1960s and 1970s more or less to themselves, as they created the building blocks of what became the world's single most focused, state-run, well-funded public diplomacy campaign. Ultimately, Saudi Arabia invested far more in this campaign than the Soviet Union or the United States allocated to their public diplomacy during the Cold War. The campaign sought to impose the kingdom's ultra-conservative, austere, and Puritan strand of the faith, known as Wahhabism, on Muslim communities across the globe. The Saudi effort, in contrast to the soft power endeavors of the United States, which could rely on its private sector cultural attributes, was by necessity a top-down, largely government-financed initiative that garnered support among Muslims worldwide. The bulk of Saudi monies went to non-violent, ultra-conservative religious, cultural, and media institutions in countries stretching from China, across Eurasia and Africa into the Americas. In recent years, the level of Saudi funding has significantly dropped, and the primary focus of the kingdom's religious soft power diplomacy has changed with the rise of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The original vehicles, like the Muslim World League, have been turned into propagators of bin Salman's problematic image of Saudi Arabia as a cutting-edge, progressive, forward-looking, and tolerant society, rather than the harsh, inaccessible, and secretive kingdom it once was. Bin Salman's campaign seeks to portray decades of Saudi support for an intolerant and supremacist Muslim worldview as an aberration of history. The drive conveniently overlooks Saudi Arabia's abysmal human rights record and the limits to non-Muslim religious practices that it imposes. The campaign is designed to open doors, attract foreign investment, and position Saudi Arabia as a major player on the international stage, through demonstrative acts that create an image that does not necessarily reflect reality. To be clear, this is not to deny that there has been significant change in Saudi Arabia, with enhanced rights for women and cultural liberalization. Saudi Arabia's most performative act was the February 2020 visit to the Nazi concentration camp Auschwitz in Poland by a delegation of 25 prominent Muslim clergymen led by Mohammed al-Issa, the head of the Muslim World League, and the group's forging of alliances with Jewish and evangelical communities. To cement the kingdom's new image, al-Issa travels the world to promote Saudi Arabia's vaguely defined concept of religious moderation and tolerance, engages in ceremonial interfaith dialogue, and issues declarative statements. Even so, the kingdom's significant retreat from religiously packaged foreign funding of Sunni Muslim ultra-conservatism has created opportunity for its religious soft power competitors. The retreat also forced the kingdom to attempt to co-opt those seeking to advance a more pluralistic and truly tolerant Islam that involves jurisprudential reform and an unrestricted endorsement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because they pose a challenge to what amounts to the kingdom's self-serving endeavor. Foremost among these more progressive forces is Indonesia's Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest and most moderate Muslim civil society movement, which has engaged with its authoritarian rivals, including the Muslim World League and various groups sponsored by the United Arab Emirates, but has not accommodated their autocratic inclinations, despite at times accepting financial contributions. Moreover, facts on the ground in the kingdom and beyond call into question the extent of Saudi moderation and the degree to which it is structurally cemented. Reform in the kingdom involves carefully managed, genuine social change, but does not amount to a wholesale repudiation of long-standing Islamic jurisprudence that embraces obsolete, outdated, and supremacist concepts. Significant reforms, such as subjugation of the kingdom's ultra-conservative religious establishment, greater rights and opportunities for women, and the creation of an entertainment industry, were driven by Crown Prince Mohammed's perceived political requirements, as well as the economic and social building blocks he needed to diversify the Saudi economy. The reforms were at best anchored in rulings of hardly independent courts and religious scholars issued in line with government policy, rather than in a sweeping reinterpretation of religious law that would redefine Islamic jurisprudence as such. The government, in its bid to create a 21st century economy, has stressed the importance of non-religious education, with an emphasis on science and languages. Yet the removal from school books of supremacist and racist concepts and language since the 9/11 Al-Qaeda attacks has proven to be a slow and torturous process. The United Nations Commission on International Religious Freedom reported 5 years after King Salman's ascent to the throne that despite progress in recent years, Saudi textbooks have seen some backsliding regarding language inciting hatred and violence toward non-Muslims. More recently, the Israel-based textbook watchdog Impact SE gave Saudi Arabia a more positive rating. Prince Mohammed's embrace of religious tolerance and interfaith dialogue has produced frequent public interactions with Jewish and Christian leaders, but not led to a lifting of the ban on non-Muslim public worship in the kingdom and the building of non-Muslim houses of worship. Similarly, the kingdom, despite its designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, has continued to work with the group in, for example, Southeast Asia. The battle for the soul of Islam accelerated with the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The battle grew significantly more complex in the wake of 9/11, with the additional focus on the fight against transnational jihadists. More recently, the emphasis has shifted to competing efforts by multiple Middle Eastern and Asian Muslim majority states that, in their bid to garner religious soft power, either support or oppose not only violent, but also non-violent expressions of political Islam, such as the Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and Tablighi Jamaat. Each of the primary actors in this struggle seeks to impose their definition of how the faith should govern the religious and political life of believers across the globe. This struggle is occurring against the backdrop of a world in which the embrace of religious belief and the rise of nationalism and populism reflect the widespread disintegration of norms, values, and traditional worldviews that historically served to anchor individuals and provide meaning to their lives. Policymakers often concentrate on distinct policies and measures enacted by various major players. Most recently, these included Saudi Arabia's lifting of bans that restricted women's social and economic mobility, the United Arab Emirates' emphasis on tolerance and individual social rights, as well as its establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel, the focus on interfaith dialogue by some of the contenders for religious soft power, and containment of perceived threats from nonviolent expressions of political Islam. In the evolution of the battle for the soul of Islam, the Islamic Revolution in Iran marked the moment that Saudi funding no longer was in a class of its own. The revolution heralded a new phase in the Saudi-Iranian rivalry that has engulfed the Middle East, North Africa, and the non-Arab Muslim world, as well as the international community for decades. Competition for religious soft power is a fixture of the rivalry that is alive and kicking, despite the recent reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Riyadh and Tehran. So is the difference in Saudi and Iranian concepts of religious soft power, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. Both approaches have sectarian traits. Saudi Arabia's thrust, driven by geopolitics, was, with few exceptions, designed to garner religious influence. Iran, on the other hand, focused on hard power in various Arab countries, in which it supported religious militants. In Africa and Asia, however, Iran struck a different note by targeting religious communities and emphasizing spiritual and social issues. The Iranian approach was shaped by a shift in Iran as a result of the Iran-Iraq War, from revolutionary religious zeal to Iranian nationalism. This was evident in emotive debates in parliament about the utility of the occupation of the US embassy in Tehran at a time that Iran was at war with Iraq. Men like Hojatollah Islam Hashemi Rafsanjani, the Speaker of the Parliament, who later became president, Ayatollah Mohammad Beheshti, the number 2 in the Iranian political hierarchy at the time, and Chief Jurist Ayatollah Sadegh Khalkhali, who was known as the hanging judge for his penchant for the death penalty, argued unsuccessfully in favor of a quick resolution of the embassy crisis so that Iran could focus on the defense of its territory and revolution. The debate signaled a shift from what was initially an ideological rivalry to a geopolitical fight that continues today with a religious soft and hard power strategy, driven by the perception that the United States and the Gulf states were seeking to topple the Islamic regime. If the first phase of the battle for the soul of Islam was initially largely uncontested Saudi religious soft power efforts, and the second phase involved the emergence of an Iranian revolutionary competitor, the third and most recent phase is the most complex one, not only with the arrival of new players, but also because it involves rivalries within rivalries. This third phase is complicated by the fact that Iran's coupling of political and religious soft and hard power that often involves recruitment of mercenaries and proxies has, with the exception of Indonesia's approach, become the norm. That was evident with the Saudi-UAE military intervention in Libya, Emirati, Egyptian, and Turkish support for opposing sides in Libya's civil war, and Gulf state and Turkish involvement in Syria. It's also evident in the current fighting in Sudan. Finally, the third phase lays bare the fact that employing notions of a moderate and tolerant Islam to garner religious soft power frequently is at best narrowly tailored to cater to the needs of public diplomacy as well as the requirements of economic reform. Various of the rivals failed to fully implement at home principles of political, social, and religious tolerance, pluralism, gender equality, and human rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They also refrained from embedding these principles in a drive for recontextualization of Islamic jurisprudence as a building block for peace and stability. This enables an autocratic form of Islam that is socially liberal, but politically supports the principle of absolute obedience to the ruler. The rise of political Islam, particularly as a result of the 2011 popular Arab revolts that toppled leaders in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen, fueled the worst fears of men like Crown Prince Mohammed, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed. The revolts persuaded the UAE, a country that prides itself on being a cutting-edge home to people from some 190 countries, to adopt a two-pronged strategy. While projecting itself as an open and tolerant society at the forefront of Islamic moderation and tolerance, respect for religious diversity, and interfaith dialogue, the UAE, together with Saudi Arabia, lobbied in Western capitals for crackdowns on expressions of non-violent political Islam, such as the Muslim Brotherhood. In doing so, it risked encouraging Islamophobia. In the Muslim world, the UAE, like Turkey and Iran, employed checkbook diplomacy and investments alongside arm twisting and military power to counter Islamists and shape religious and political environments. Speaking in 2005 to U.S. Ambassador James Jeffrey, bin Zayed made no bones about his disdain for Salafism and Saudi ultra-conservatism. He compared Saudi Arabia's religious leaders to somebody like the one we are chasing in the mountains, a reference to Osama bin Laden, who was believed at the time to be hiding in a mountainous region of Pakistan. In an email to New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman 12 years later, Yusuf al-Otaiba, a confidant of bin Zayed and the UAE's ambassador in Washington, assured that Abu Dhabi fought 200 years of wars with Saudi over Wahhabism. Private Emirati scorn for Saudi Wahhabism translated in 2016 into a UAE effort to undermine Saudi religious diplomacy by sponsoring a gathering of prominent Sunni Muslim leaders in the Chechen capital of Grozny that effectively excommunicated the kingdom's interpretation of the faith. Western officials refrained from publicly commenting, but privately commended the attempt to confront a worldview that they feared provided breeding grounds for social tensions and extremism. Bin Zayed played a key role in shaping bin Salman's policies to shave off Wahhabism's rougher edges, rather than wholesale reform the kingdom's religious worldview and bring the UAE and Saudi Arabia's religious soft power endeavors closer together. His approach centered on what author Shadi Hamid calls non-political, politicized Islam, or a third trend in political Islam, that in the words of scholar Gregory Gauss, is tightly tied to state authority and subservient to it. Bin Zayed's efforts have paid off. Despite ruling at home with an iron fist, bin Zayed has been able to promote a state-controlled Islam that styles itself as tolerant and apolitical and preaches absolute obedience without legally addressing outdated or intolerant concepts embedded in the faith. These include notions of kafirs or infidels, slavery, Muslim supremacy, and the concept of a caliphate that remain reference points even if large numbers of Muslims do not heed them. Bin Zayed's success, backed by armies of paid Western lobbyists, is evidenced by the fact that in contrast to bin Salman and Saudi Arabia's reputational problems, as a result in part of the 2018 killing in Istanbul of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the arrests and alleged torture of dissidents, as well as anyone deemed a potential threat, the UAE is widely perceived as a religiously tolerant, pluralistic, and enlightened society. The UAE has also successfully projected itself as a secular state, even though its constitution requires legislation to be compatible with Islamic law. In doing so, UAE leaders walk a fine line. The UAE scored one of its most significant successes with the first ever papal visit to the Emirates by Pope Francis, during which he signed a document on human fraternity with Ahmed al-Tayyib, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, an ancient citadel of Islamic learning. The Pope acknowledged the UAE's growing influence when, in a public address, he thanked his late advisor, Egyptian Judge Mohammed Abdel Salam, who was also close to Egypt's al-Sisi, for drafting the declaration. Abdel Salam ensured that the UAE and the Egyptian president, rather than Al-Azhar, put their stamp on the document. Indonesia, the new kid on the block in the competition for Muslim religious soft power and leadership, has proven to be a different kettle of fish. Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest and most moderate Muslim civil society movement, rather than the government of President Joko Widodo, has emerged as a formidable rival capable of operating on the same level as states with which it competes. The Indonesian state initially took a back seat in the global competition. It benefited from its incestuous ties to Nahdlatul Ulama, as well as the movement's ability to gain access to the corridors of power in world capitals, including Washington, London, Berlin, Budapest, Brussels, the Vatican, and Delhi. Nahdlatul Ulama was instrumental in organizing a visit to Indonesia in 2020 by Pope Francis that had to be postponed because of the coronavirus pandemic and finally took place just a few weeks ago. It, rather than the government, invited and arranged a trip to Jakarta by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who made a speech to a Nahdlatul Ulama event, the centerpiece of his visit. All of that changed with the 2022 chairmanship of the Group of 20, Indonesian chairmanship of the Group of 20. Indonesia made its mark with a summit of religious leaders that preceded the meeting of heads of government and state. The summit refashioned the G20's erstwhile interfaith track as the Religion 20, or R20. The R20 intended to bring together religious leaders to position religion as a source of solutions rather than problems. It was a call that resonated coming from the world's most populous Muslim majority country and democracy. It's also a call that threatens the existing order, which is why neither India nor Brazil have made the R20 part of their G20 chairmanship. The R20 summit laid down a gauntlet for advocates of an autocratic form of moderate Islam by stressing the need to deal with historical grievances, truth-telling, reconciliation, and forgiveness, even if it was co-hosted by the Muslim World League, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed's vehicle to garner religious soft power and help polish the kingdom's tarnished image. The League saw the invitation to co-host as legitimization by one of the world's most important Muslim civil society movements, as well as an opportunity to co-opt it, an effort that has so far failed. In contrast to its Saudi and Emirati rivals, Nahdlatul Ulama has gone beyond paying lip service to notions of tolerance and pluralism. With the issuance of jurisprudence intended to recontextualize the faith by eliminating problematic categories like infidels, the first of several such expected moves. In February of last year, the movement called for the replacement in Islamic law of the concept of the caliphate, a unitary state for the global Muslim community, with the notion of a nation state. The underlying argument was that only a change in religious law would deprive militants and jihadists of the ability to justify their ideology and actions. Nahdlatul Ulama's evolution towards a process of recontextualization dates to a 1992 gathering of religious scholars, chaired by Abdurrahman Wahid, the group's leader at the time and later president of Indonesia. The gathering noted that the changing context of reality necessitates the creation of new interpretations of Islamic law and orthodox Islamic teaching. Nahdlatul Ulama's ability to compete is evident in the increasingly influential role that it plays in the centrist Democratic International, or CDI, the world's largest alliance of political parties that grew out of an alliance of European and Latin American Christian Democrats, and today groups ruling parties across the globe. CDI's executive committee includes top German officials, controversial Central European government leaders, including Viktor Orban of Hungary, as well as some of Europe and Latin America's most prominent politicians and former leaders. Nahdlatul Ulama's sway was evident in a resolution that was adopted at a meeting of the CDI Executive Committee in January 2020 in Yogyakarta that was holding Nahdlatul Ulama's thinking and language. The resolution called for the rule of law, adherence to universal ethics and humanitarian values based on Western humanism, Christian democracy, and Nahdlatul Ulama's concept of humanitarian Islam. The resolution urged CDI to push for a world based on those principles to counter the emergence of authoritarian, civilizationalist states that do not accept the rules-based post-World War II order, whether in terms of human rights, rule of law, democracy, or respect of international borders and the sovereignty of other nations. Neither Saudi Arabia nor the UAE anticipated Nahdlatul Ulama's determination to push its concept of humanitarian Islam globally, including at the highest levels of government in Western capitals, as well as in countries like India. The degree to which Nahdlatul Ulama is perceived as a threat by the UAE and Saudi Arabia is evident in battles in high-level interfaith meetings convened by the Vatican, the State Department, and competition with Saudi Arabia and the UAE in influencing the religious tack of the India and Brazil-chaired G20 summits in New Delhi and in Brazil. Nahdlatul Ulama's rise to prominence was also what persuaded Mohammed Al-Issa, the head of the Muslim World League, to visit the Indonesian group's headquarters in Jakarta in early 2020. It was the first visit to one of the world's foremost Islamic organizations in the league's more than 60-year history. Membership in CDI of the National Awakening Party, or PKB, the political party nominally associated with Nahdlatul Ulama, gave it a leg up on the UAE and Saudi Arabia, both who do not qualify for membership because they ban political parties. Moreover, Nahdlatul Ulama benefited from what journalist Muhammad Abu Fadl has described as a rejection of an Arab face of Islam that, in his words, is hopelessly contorted by extremism in Western perceptions. Abu Fadl, a close associate of Egyptian President El-Sisi, suggested that certain elements in the West have become interested in Asian Islam, which appears to be more moderate than Arab Islam, less inclined to export radical ideology, less dominated by extremist interpretations of religion, and possessed of a genuine and sincere tendency to act with tolerance, according to Abu Fadl. In sum, the battle for the soul of Islam is being fought at multiple levels and across numerous platforms, ranging from the world's corridors of power to mosques and villages in the Indonesian countryside, to efforts to win hearts and minds in countries with young populations whose attitudes towards religion and religiosity are changing. Ultimately, these changing youth attitudes may be one factor determining the outcome of the battle for the soul of Islam. Thank you. I look forward to Muhammad's remarks, and I look forward to question and answers and a free-flowing discussion.
Faisal, take out the picture part. Thank you, Dr. Dorsey. Faisal, yeah. Thank you so much. Now let's hear Dr. Professor Muhammad Fadil, and then after that we have the question and answer session. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you, James, for inviting me to be a respondent. I've been a long time admirer of your writing. Perhaps like many, I discovered your blog during the Arab Spring, and it's been a go-to read ever since. So thank you very much for your writing and your continued work. This is a very interesting topic, and I have a few comments. In terms of the description of the politics of religion in the Muslim world, I have little to disagree about. I think you do have a battle, generally speaking, in the Islamic world among different alignments of religion and politics. You could broadly speak of authoritarian interpretations of Islam versus Republican interpretations of Islam. That's kind of the categorization that I prefer. I tend to be a little more skeptical of moderate versus extremist, because moderation is oftentimes in the eye of the beholder. Things that might seem to be quite extreme from something in Egypt might seem very normal in Indonesia. And there's a long different history of Islam in Indonesia and Egypt that might explain these things. So I don't want to get into it, but into those kinds of details. What I think is much more interesting for us from the perspective of political science is, why is it that there are certain different formations of the theopolitical, if we could use that term? Why is it that in Indonesia, Islam seems to be consistent with democratizing reforms, whereas in the Arab world, Islam is being appropriated to further an authoritarian agenda? I think here we should look a little bit at the different political economies of Muslim states. I think it makes a huge difference that a country like the UAE can rely on oil rents to fund the state and to fund the state's projects, and doesn't really need the buy-in of its citizens, much less 90% of its population that are not citizens. Indonesia, on the other hand, is a sprawling country. Having spent 5 or 6 weeks there, I came back thinking, wow, what a miracle that Indonesia even exists at all. It spans 3 time zones, east to west. There are over 300 ethnic groups, 300 linguistic groups. Its national language isn't even the mother tongue, I think, of any significant one of those groups. And yet it's managed to stay together and prosper. So one of the reasons why, and this is, I think, an important point to understand, is that in Indonesia, Islam serves as a way to create common identity in a context where there, if not for Islam, there could be endless ethnic conflict, right? Whereas in the Arab world, because of a different political economy, a different history of colonialism, right? Islam comes into conflict with the state because it creates cross-border solidarities that are not consistent with the political interests of the ruling class. So something like the Muslim Brotherhood, it's not so much that it's religiously extreme that makes it threatening to states like the UAE or Saudi Arabia. It's the fact that it can create networks of cross-border solidarity among Egyptians, among Saudis, among UAEs, among Palestinians, among Syrians, etc., in which those cross-border solidarities can compete with the loyalties that citizens feel toward their states, right? Now, that could be a bad thing if the states that they are competing with are working in some sort of way for the common good. But the problem, I think, and this is where I want to go back to the political economy, if you look at the political economy of the Arab world, it's hard to argue that the political economy of the Arab world is manifested in the post-colonial Arab state is working for the prosperity and progress of their populations. Economists have different classifications of economic systems and or different varieties of capitalism, they call it. And you have the Nordic model of capitalism, you have the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism, you have the Southern European model of capitalism, and they have something they call oligarchic capitalism. And oligarchic capitalism is when the economic system is dominated by a narrow elite, and they basically use their power over the state to make rules to enrich themselves as opposed to the public at large. And they said that oligarchic capitalism dominates in the Arab world and Latin America, right? So it's not surprising that you have very poor economic growth, very high economic inequality, and as a result, you need to have authoritarian systems to maintain this kind of political economy. Indonesia can't be run in the same way as the UAE. As I said, it is simply, even though Indonesia does have a lot of natural resources, it doesn't have enough where it can make the state independent of civil society. Development in Indonesia requires the cooperation of civil society, right? So the state cannot pursue the same kind of repression that political elites in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf generally can. They simply lack those resources to be able to give them sufficient independence to rule in that sort of autocratic fashion. Now, I think this is a good thing because over the long term, Indonesia is going to have a lot more influence on the Muslim world than the UAE or Saudi Arabia or even Egypt for that matter, right? When I got back from my time in Indonesia, I wrote a blog post on the website of my host. I was hosted as a senior visiting fellow at the Indonesian International Islamic University. I'm not sure if I got the order right. It's triple IU. And one of the things I stated in my column was that I think that Indonesia is going to be the center of the Islamic world. I mean, this might be shocking to a lot of Arabs or South Asian Muslims, right? Because they don't associate Southeast Asia as a traditional Muslim imperial center. But if you look objectively at the sources of power in the material in the modern world, no country in the Islamic world can compete with Indonesia. It's by far the largest Muslim country. It has almost 300 million people. It's politically stable, and it's been has a long history of established growth, right? So if it continues on the path that it's going, right, in 30 years, it's going to have maybe one of the top 5 economies in the world. So it has the potential, as I say, to be a Muslim China. What I mean by that is it has such weight by virtue of its numbers, the size of its economy, the rate of its growth, is that there can be a kind of Muslim ecosystem that develops around Indonesia, right? Which is impossible to imagine around the Gulf states. The Gulf states, by contrast, have served a negative role in the development of regional countries who have fallen into their orbit by virtue of the Dutch disease, and we can talk about how that works. But it's basically taken away any sort of incentive of labor exporting states like Pakistan, Egypt, Syria, etc., to engage in indigenous economic development, because instead their skilled labor migrates to the Gulf and makes money and comes back and just plows it into consumption instead of development. Indonesia can serve as a center, a regional center for investment and knowledge production in a way that the Gulf states never can. So I have a lot of optimism in the future role that Indonesia will play in the Muslim world. Now, a couple of things that I find a little mysterious, not mysterious, but a question about James's analysis. He puts a lot of weight on the Nahda, which is great, nothing against the Nahda, but there's also another very big civil society organization, the Muhammadiyah, right? So I would be curious to hear what he has to say about the Muhammadiyah in Indonesia, because in some ways they are rivals. The Nahda is, at least ostensibly, much more traditionalist in their approach to Islam, where the Nahda, the Muhammadiyah folks, at least in their rhetoric, they say they are much more modernist. I think the important thing is that they work through various institutions of civil society in Indonesia in a way that reinforces the development of the state, right? So I'm not supposed to talk too much more. So one last thing that I want to point out here is, I think what has to be taken into account is the radically different political circumstances. I'm talking about geopolitical circumstances of Southeast Asia and Southwest Asia. So Southeast Asia is, in many ways, I would say, a kind of utopian place where you have all these different countries, but through ASEAN, they are really on the same page. They're all rowing together. They look beyond ideological, ethnic, and religious differences, and they're all working together for a common future. Southwest Asia, as we know, is the exact opposite of that, right? It's the exact opposite, where there is an incapacity to live peacefully with one's neighbors, right? And this reflects in understandings of religion. So sovereignty is secure in Southeast Asia. It's very insecure in Southwest Asia. And I think that also is something that needs to be taken into account. Now, there's a lot, finally, one last point. As a historian of Islamic intellectual history and as a political theorist and as a lawyer, I'm always very suspicious or cast doubt on the importance of certain particular concepts. Concepts like the caliphate are highly contested. It's not, I don't think it's intellectually, I think we risk oversimplifying things. For example, at the end of World War I, the leading Egyptian lawyer, leading Arab lawyer, Abd al-Razak al-Sanhuri, wrote a dissertation on the caliphate, right? And his conception of the caliphate was, it is absolutely an obligation for Muslims, right? But it absolutely has to be consistent with modern conceptions of law and legality and self-determination of peoples, right? And so he viewed the caliphate as a kind of UN. If you read what he says, he thinks of the caliphate as a league of nations for what he calls the Oriental states, Eastern states. And he viewed it as a way of mediating between particularism and universalism, because he was greatly worried that in an age of nationalism, post-colonial Muslim states would end up fighting with each other. And in many ways, he has been correct. And he viewed the establishment of the establishment of a reformed caliphate and along the lines that he saw it as a necessary antidote to preventing the ills of extreme nationalism that had just destroyed Europe, right? So I appreciate the efforts of the Nahda as a political force, but I would just be a little skeptical sometimes about their sort of normative claims, and how much rigor is behind them. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all the three speakers. And before we go to questions session, here is the announcement for coming Saturday. It's from Delhi. The speaker, Dr. Tanveer Ejaz from Delhi University, Political Science Department. His topic is contextualizing social justice in asymmetrical federalism. So it is about the minorities and their how much they get in a larger India or the smaller state versus bigger states and different communities. So please join there. And over to question and answer session moderated by Dr. Rafat Hussain. Rafat.
Would
you.
you allow? Yeah. Hi. Would you allow me to briefly respond to Muhammad?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Muhammad. Thank you very much for the comments. I, by and large, agree with you. Let me just make three or four points. One is, I would agree with the distinction of authoritarian or autocratic versus republican or pluralistic or whatever you want to do. The reason I opted for moderate because of the discussion about moderate Islam, whatever that may be, and in some ways it's a euphemism. I understand that, but nonetheless, that was the reason why I opted for it, and it was purely, if you wish, opportunistic. One thing I want to add, and Greg may have something to say about this too, with regard to the differences between Indonesia and Middle Eastern Muslim states. And I think there are two major differences. One is the way Islam, particularly in Java, was socialized. And it was a pluralistic, very tolerant environment in which that happened, not a conflictuous environment. And certainly Nahdlatul Ulama is a movement that is as much influenced by Islam as it is by Javan culture. I think the other issue is also, and I wrote a book with my wife several years ago, which compared political transition in Southeast Asia with political transition in the Middle East, and why, to whatever degree, popular revolts were successful in Southeast Asia, at least initially, and more problematic in the Middle East. And that has to do with the role of the military. It has to do with the way US aid and Western aid functioned. It also has to do with the fact that you had, even in autocratic Southeast Asia, strong underground civil societies, much more than you have in the Middle East. The last point I want to make briefly is on the issue of the concept of a caliphate. I think, well, let me just briefly also say Muhammadiyya is an important movement. It's probably the second largest, second or third largest Muslim civil society movement worldwide. The reason I focused on Nahdlatul Ulama rather than on Muhammadiyya is because Nahdlatul Ulama has taken this much further than Muhammadiyya has, and has also engaged internationally in a way that Muhammadiyya has not. So those were the reasons. The last point I want to make, which was with regard to the concept of the caliphate and all of that, is to keep in mind that Nahdlatul Ulama is also as much a nationalist movement as it is a religious movement. And therefore that concept of the nation state is an important concept. And if anything, in my mind, Nahdlatul Ulama has yet to find the balance between itself as a national Indonesian movement and a movement that wants to be a global mover and shaker, if you wish. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So the question and answer session is open now. So you can raise your digital hand or you can put your comment and question in the chat box. So thank you. Before we begin, thank you, Mr. Dorsey, for wonderful analysis on the battle for the soul of Islam, and Professor Greg Burton for the introduction, and Professor Fadel for his interesting take on the Indonesia. So let's begin the question and answer. And first one from the chat box is Tariq Faruqi. And Tariq Faruqi is asking, while Muslims must take the initiative for the positive change, please reflect on the Western self-interest that props up dictators and autocrats and subverts democracies in the Muslim world. It seems that Western interests such as control of oil and other resources and blind support of Israeli expansionism makes internal positive change harder. Professor Dorsey, please. Mr. Dorsey.
There's no question that, in my mind at least, that Western support for autocrats, Muslim and non-Muslim, but certainly in this case Muslim, complicates processes of change, or even counters processes of change. Having said that, that doesn't resolve Muslims of the responsibility for taking charge of their own affairs and managing their own affairs. That is to say, I don't think, I'm not justifying Western policies, on the contrary. But on the other hand, I don't think it should be used as an excuse to maintain the status quo.
Can I comment on that too?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, this is something I hear a lot from my Egyptian friends. I'm Egyptian, and they say, yes, we hear all your criticisms, but Egypt, we're not free to do. We're dominated. We're colonized, et cetera, et cetera. And to a certain extent, I'm sympathetic with that. Obviously, Egypt doesn't have the same freedom of action that the United States has, right? But nevertheless, there is a domain to act. And the question that Muslim societies have to face is not, yes, we're dominated. It's like, where are our domains of freedom? And what can we do with the freedom that we actually have? So I did a quick Google search. I was comparing GDP per capita between Pakistan and Indonesia. Now, both Indonesia and Pakistan are post-colonial states. Neither have a huge amount of power in the international system. But if you compare their growth since 1960, Indonesia has performed maybe 4 orders of magnitude better than Pakistan. So Pakistan and Egypt and Indonesia in 1960 pretty much had the same per capita income. Now it's 4 times greater in Indonesia. In 1960, Indonesia was poorer than Egypt. Now Indonesia is, on a per capita basis, maybe exceeds Egyptian per capita income by 1/3. So policy, you do have some freedom in the choices you make. You're not as free as an advanced capitalist economy, but there is some policy choices for you to make, and they have to take responsibility for the choices that they make, right? And so, yes, colonialism, post-colonialism, neo-colonialism, all those things are real, but there also is agency, and it has to be accepted.
Thank you so much. And so next question from chat box is from Nadeem Khan. So it is said that Islam does not have nationalism. Is it the only reason why soul of Islam and its numerous definitions assume importance?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. The question was whether
Let me repeat it. It is said that Islam does not have nationalism. Is it the only reason why soul of Islam and its numerous definitions assume importance? It's not clear to me either, but what we can make out of it. Is it the only reason why the soul of Islam assume importance?
Well, I don't know that religions are such have nationalisms. I mean, with other words, I don't know that Islam in that sense is any different from Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism. And at the same time, I think we've seen the rise of religious nationalism, whether that's the ultra nationalists in Israel, whether that's Christian nationalists, Christian Zionists, whether that's Hindu nationalism. We're seeing that across the board in religions. So, rightfully or wrongfully, and I would say wrongfully, but nonetheless, the if you want to call it the nature of Islam was called into question by the actions of jihadist groups and movements, particularly in the post 9/11 atmosphere. And what you saw happen was autocratic regimes respond to that and trying to prove themselves to be the expressions of moderation, and then using that whole formula to crack down on dissent at home and to tighten control. So I don't think so. With other words, what I've described as the battle for the soul of Islam is a product of that, but it's also a battle, to be frank, that could take place in Judaism, which has, again, serious problems in terms of legal structures for very different reasons than Islam, but nonetheless.
Thank you so much. And next question is from Shrikant Chopra, and then I will come back to the digital hand. This question is about the book on the Naipaul. So about 30 years ago, V.S. Naipaul came out with a book titled Among the Believers, which to many was a very early attempt to explain the contradiction of Islam and modernity of the late 20th century. Do you have any thoughts about the observations shared and expressed in that book?
I mean, again, there was a lot of discussion and debate about V.S. Naipaul's book. And I mean, there were a lot that felt that there was a significant amount of prejudice in it. I don't think that to me, the issue is not Islam and modernity. To me, the issue is much more if you wish, the political manipulation of Islam on the one hand, and the need, which is true for all religions, the need for recontextualization as the world moves on, which is, and to be fair, that's one of the things that fascinates me about Nahdlatul Ulama is, and Muhammad probably can speak to this too, is the history of reform in Islam was always intellectuals, individuals, small groups of people. This is the first time, at least to the best of my knowledge, that you have a mass movement with significant clout, educational clout. It has its own militia, of 5 million people. It has universities. It has some 18,000 religious seminaries, a following of 90 million people. It's in a class of its own, which in and of itself makes this a very different attempt or a very different endeavor.
Thank you so much. The next person who raised the hand is Dr. Saeed Zadi.
So Islam, looking back 1400 years ago, was Islam, and politics was there. But if we divide into three phases, first phase is just probably internal politics, a tussle between religious leader or Khalifa or whoever was involved. But the phase 2 and 3 was external forces came in. So my first question is that how much Islam is polluted, corrupted, divided, changed by external internal forces in those last few hundred years, or I would say last 200 years mostly. So that's number one question. Number two is, I think we left a big sect which is growing very fast in last 20 or 30 years because of 1970s when Qadianis and Ahmadis was declared non-Muslim. So in Africa, they're growing like in millions every year because of the work they're doing. So I just want to talk and ask both of you. Thank you.
So sorry, your last question was reference to the Ahmadis and.
So the growth of Ahmadis in the world, before it was mostly in the part of India and Pakistan, but now they're working in Africa. In Africa, they're doing, and they have a 24-hour TVs, not one in every language, Arabic, English, Urdu, Hindi, whatever name you do it, and they have working, they're doing a job what Christians did it in India and other parts of the world. They have hospitals, charity hospitals, free clinics, schools, and that's what they're doing in Africa. And they are actually, they claim, I don't know how much is true, but they're converting in the heart of Saudi Arabia, that people are converting to Ahmadi. That's what they claim. I don't know the numbers, but Africa number is, I know, and they showed me that it's pretty big in last 20, 30 years.
I mean, in terms of external influence on Islam, there's no doubt about it. But then, as a matter of principle, that's true for almost, for all religions and many entities. You interact with the world. For sure, there's been, the colonialism, colonial rule has played a major role and has influenced Islam. I'm not able to quantify that in terms of how much. But it's a factor without question. With regard to the Ahmadis, I've dealt with Ahmadis in Pakistan, in England, but I have not followed them that closely, and I'm not aware of what they're doing in Africa. In Saudi Arabia, I don't think there's any way of really tracking that. Keep in mind that, coming back to what I earlier said about abusing the positioning of oneself as moderate, Saudi Arabia legally qualifies atheism as a form of terrorism. So I'm not quite sure that anybody who, there's a lot of talk about atheism being on the rise in Saudi Arabia as well as in other countries. But I'm not sure how one, accurately tracks those kind of conversions or developments, including the Ahmadis, in an environment like Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. The next question, next raised hand is from Dr. Iltafat Hassan.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all three speakers for a wonderful talk. I have a kind of a simple question. I have noticed over the years that the more deeply religious a person is, the less tolerant he or she is. What is it in the religion that makes following it closely and less tolerant? We see it in Hinduism, we see it in Islam, we see it in Christianity, and we see it in Judaism. So what is it about the religion that makes us so much less tolerant and a lot more cruel towards others? Thank you.
I'm not sure that I know the answer to it, nor am I sure that I'm the right person to be trying to answer it. But to be fair, there are also very religious people who are, I've known them, met them, who, despite having deeply held religious beliefs, who are practicing, and in which the practice of their religion is a dominant factor in their life, who are also very tolerant and open-minded. So I don't know that religion as such and the deeper one engages or practices, that by definition makes one a more intolerant person. I think part of the problem to me is, and has always been, that religious texts are multi-interpretable, and you can read into them in many ways what you want. And if that is true, then there are probably a lot more factors that come into play beyond religion that make someone either more tolerant or less tolerant.
Thank you. Next is Dr. Syed Amir.
Thank you. Thank you, all the learned speakers. I have a simple question about whether is there a need for looking for the soul of Islam? Is that the struggle basic we should be indulging? Because how do you expect us to find the souls of Islam, a religion which stretches from Indonesia to Morocco? People bring their own culture, language, traditions, whatever, and the soul you may not find. Going back to what happened in Europe, I mean, we have a Catholic religion, and I'm sure you are aware of all the religious wars in Europe. Enlightenment came, and still they are, I mean, not looking at the soul of Catholic religion. If they were, they would never find it. This only thing about, you see, somebody mentioned about Israel. Obviously, it's a very disparate nation. There's so many divisions and all that. And it's been keep going. And the reason I think is going because they have invented an adversary, Palestinians. If you take out that element which unites them, you will see all kind of conflicts, right, plaguing Israel. So I think we better leave the soul, not stop searching for the soul of Islam. Thank you very much.
No, I granted, I take your point on the soul of Islam. The reason that I chose that concept was because essentially, certainly in the post 9/11 period, but even before that, but in the post 9/11 period, it was a battle to define what Islam stands for. And that was what I was focusing on. Now, whether that's the soul of the religion or some other form of the essence of the religion is a fair enough discussion, and I grant you that. Without wanting to get into a discussion on Israel, I don't think that the issue of Palestine was an invented issue that binds Israel together. What binds Israel together is far more than the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian issue arose because Palestinians were there when the Zionist movement started immigrating, even though there was a Jewish presence in Palestine all along. Let's be clear about that. But what binds Israel together is, and the divisions, there are major divisions, and Israel is as polarized as many other countries are today. But there's more that binds the country together than the Palestinian issue. If anything, the Palestinian issue was long a very divisive issue.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Dr. Tariq Farooqi, you raised your hand. Do you want to ask another question?
Yes, thank you for the discussion. Very difficult to describe the soul of Islam and see it in where Islam originated from, like the Middle East. Example was given by Professor Muhammad Fadel about Indonesia, which is far away from the Middle East, and where positive changes taking place. I think, unfortunately, in the Middle East, they have oil and other natural resources, and their Western interests that seem to, we talk about democracy and we talk about rules-based order, but we have seen over the past so many years that the way it is applied is very subjective, that we normally seem to prefer dictators, military rulers, because they're more kind of fit in our plans and they kind of subservient to us rather than democracies that can be more difficult to control. So, as long as that is there, I mean, the interference of the outside powers, any internal changes regarding positive changes within Islam is much more difficult because then you get into a little cocoon of yourself, because you're trying to work against the outside influence. So I believe that's so unfortunate, and I think that will continue in the Middle East. I do not know what the long-term prospect of that is, but you have not mentioned the outside interference and outside influence in the heart of Islam. Any comments?
No, I haven't. That's correct, but that's also not what my book was about, and therefore that's one reason why I haven't mentioned it. The one thing which I think is important is that, in a sense, if you look at U.S. policy, foreign policy towards the Middle East over the decades, oil was one factor, and was certainly the factor that that invested U.S. interest in the region, but the other was Israel, and the interest in Israel, I think, goes in some ways far deeper than the interest in oil, and it has to do with, on the one hand, one of the successes of the Zionist movement from the very beginning was its lobbying effort.
No doubt.
And it's been brilliant, and Israel is probably the country with the single most largest grassroots support in the United States, far more than any other one. And of course, you have the whole relationship with Christian groups who, for their own reasons, are pro-Israel. And so I think that you would have had some degree of involvement in the Middle East, irrespective of the oil issue, because of those very deep connections between Israel and significant segments of U.S. society.
Thank you. Professor Wade, do you have any comment on the outside influence on the Islam? The question is being asked again and again.
Are you asking my opinion?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's, again, outside the geopolitical the geopolitical context makes a big difference. At the end of the World War I, the Arabic-speaking provinces of the Ottoman Empire were divided into numerous states under different sort of European powers, and these set up different kinds of regimes. I was not privy, I was not in the room. I don't know exactly what the intent behind all of that was, but it doesn't certainly seem to be consistent with the idea of having a unified post-Ottoman Arab state. I think if you did, you would have you could potentially have a very different trajectory of development, right? One of the big problems that you see in the Arab world is by virtue of the oil windfall, right? Is you have very low population states having massive amounts of excess capital that they cannot possibly invest in their own economies, right? And this leads to all sorts of problems at the macroeconomic level. On the other hand, had there been a single Arab state that succeeded the Ottoman Empire the way that Turkey succeeded to the Turkish-speaking regions of the Ottoman Empire, then there wouldn't have been this problem of excess capital. It could have been used to fund domestic investments, right? Much as the way you see that Indonesia is able to plow its natural resource wealth into domestic development, right? But that's not what happened. I don't know if it was intentional I don't know. I find it hard. I don't think in 1919 they knew that the UAE would have a massive amount of petroleum, or Kuwait, etc. I just don't know. But that's sort of what happened, right? And the Arab states have not been able to overcome the colonial borders in a way that would benefit them collectively, right? And yes, to a certain extent, outside powers discourage them from overcoming their differences, right? But this is where I say, agency matters. Even if the United States does not want you to integrate, you should take responsibility for yourself and work harder, right, to overcome these barriers. Because they're not going to help you, let's say, but does that mean you then exacerbate it on your own? So sure, it plays a role, but you can't, the people in the region are kind of doing their part to make those divisions worse, right? So that's at least my opinion.
Thank you so much. The next,
If I can add one more thing to that.
Shay, please go.
And that is, I think that if you look at the post-colonial creation of states, you often get states, look at Africa, of which the boundaries are questionable. Yet what you get is the generation of some sort of identity that identifies within those national borders. And that's true, I think, in the Arab world, where the attempts at transcending those borders, the Egyptian-Syrian Union in 1958, for example, failed. Because ultimately, and that's what you're seeing more and more today, is that Arab states are nation states.
Yeah.
And they have those identities as artificial as they may be, but they actually do live a life of their own.
Thank you both. Dr. Abdul Jabbar, please.
So thank you. Wonderful illuminated discussions. Thank you for everyone of three panel members here. So I really enjoyed. Regarding the soul of, first, I want to just clarify regarding the soul of Islam. For me, the egalitarian conception of Islam, the soul of Islam. That's what I want to say that first. So I'm a scientist. I look at the problems in the societies, how the societies progress because the scientific innovation. I think that 2 weeks ago, Professor Rahman talked about how the Renaissance times, how the Islamic intellectuals brought science and other technology innovation, brought to the fore of in the society, civil society. That is one of the reasons that the Islam had a strong hold on this scientific enterprise, but that kind of faded away some point. Then I think I want you're as a kind of historian, lived in different places in Islamic Muslim countries. So what is your thought on the scientific kind of fading of the scientific thoughts and in the societies, like Muslim societies, whether that really contributed to this lot of headache for society people are just grappling with? Thank you.
I mean, I'm a fan or a believer in Ahmed Kuru's theory, who has written extensively about the relationship between and the evolution of the relationship between religious scholars and the state, and ultimately how religious scholars were subjugated. And to me, there's no question that the Muslim world had significant scientific contributions, and sort of lost that advantage, if you wish. But that to me is very much a function of basically autocratic totalitarian society. One of the things that, for example, Singapore, if you look at why Singapore has been so successful, it had one asset beyond geography, and that was human capital. And it invested in human capital significantly. Sure, the Arab world, the Gulf states have done so too, but in an environment in which curiosity is a risky thing, in which critical thinking is a risky thing. And I think that's where I would look at, but I think Mohammed has something to add here. But that's where one of the things that I would look at.
How do you see the revival of the past glory? Is there any revival mechanisms that are underneath the societies operating without any overt kind of exhibition of the revival?
I'm sorry, jump in. I think we have to look at.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
If we're just talking about the Arab world, I think it's very important to distinguish Gulf states from non-Gulf states. One of the problems that you have in the Gulf states is that it's almost impossible to provide any set of incentives so that citizens of Gulf states invest in their own human capital, because the windfall of oil is so large and so extreme, right? That, if you're just adopting a rational actor model from classical economics, what's the point of obtaining, scientific expertise, engineering expertise, because the returns you get from that are almost always going to be less than the windfall you get from your state from having petroleum, right? So I've spent time in Qatar and Qatari universities, less time in the UAE. The benefits that they get simply by being born with this citizenship are so massive, it saps any kind of incentive for self-improvement, in my opinion, right? That's a big problem. And it would be very difficult for these states to say, okay, you know what, in order to convince everybody that education is really important, we're going to cut off the tap, right? You're going to have a revolution, because actually they want more. They don't want less. They want more. If you read their local presses, right? So this is an issue. It's not like in Norway, where the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, I think, invests something like 95% of their oil, and then they just live off the investments, right? So that's a problem in the Gulf. If you look at a country like Egypt, and I think this is also true for other post-Ottoman states, non-oil states, you find a very puzzling pattern. The rates of consumption as a percentage of national income is extremely high. It's off the charts. So even though Egypt, on a per capita basis, income basis, is poorer than Indonesia, on a per capita consumption basis, they consume more than Indonesians. Okay, so you can't make investments in human capital if you don't have any national savings. So for whatever reason, post-Ottoman states in the Arab world, non-oil states, are incapable of generating savings that they can then be invested in things like education. Now, Singapore is a great example. I love Singapore. Singapore has something called I think it's called the National Provident Fund. They basically force every person, every working
CPF,
Central Provident
CPF.
Fund. They basically deduct 37% of all income until you are 55, which they use for retirement, for public fund, for investment and social insurance, right? So the government is essentially taxing its people to fund growth, right? The Egyptian national savings rate is something like 10%, which is laughable for a developing country, right? So I don't know, I can't see how anybody could, with a straight face, can attribute these differences to religion. I mean, Egyptians and Indonesians have the same religion. You go to Indonesia and you actually, as an Egyptian, you feel like in many ways, oh, this is kind of like Egypt, because so many Indonesians go and study in Egypt, right? So the religious culture is very similar to Egyptian religious culture, right? But the macroeconomic policy choices are so radically different, right? So, and that this reflects in, lack of investment in education, because if you don't have savings, you can't invest in yourself.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of the hour. So last question from Rajaullah Qureshi, please.
Peace be upon everybody. First, I need to apologize. I missed the entire lecture and even partly some of the questions because I'm on the run. I'm not home. I'm in travel. I had set an alarm. Somehow it did not remind me, so I missed it. I apologize for that. So with that, if I am asking the wrong question, please do not mind. My question basically to Professor James is that obviously we have discussed the various facets of Islam, and there are fractions and the Ahmadi and this and that and Shia and Sunni, and there are several groups. My question is, do you think you find anything in the sources of Islam, and the primary source, as we all know, is the book Quran, which is intact compared to the holy scriptures of any other religion? So do you see that the problem is in the source of Islam, or it's in the human interpretations and using it according to whatever they want to whatever fits their motive? So if you can throw some light on that, thank you.
I mean, if I understand the question correctly, I think the problem is first and foremost in human interpretation and the way it's used for whatever purpose. I also think that indeed there are concepts that were perfectly understandable in a certain historical context, but take on a different meaning, a different positioning as history and society evolves, and those are issues that need to be addressed, and they are addressed in many ways in Islam, to be fair, but they may not necessarily be addressed in a form and fashion in which the jurisprudence evolves, if you wish.
Thank you so much. And that before I hand over to Dr. Raziuddin, I have a simple question to both of you. Is the concept of Ummah still valid in the modern times? Of course, you talked about the soul of Islam. So that is a simple question. I don't know if you wanted to address it. Please go ahead. The concept of Ummah is still valid in the modern times.
In my mind, you have, if you wish, all kinds of Ummahs. With other words, there are all kinds of communities that have that transcend national borders, that are global, and there's no reason why Muslims or other religious groups should not have that too. If you're talking about it in terms of legal structures, I would suggest that yes, I'm not sure there is that kind of space.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear. So back to Dr. Raziuddin, and before I hand over, then thank you so much, all three speakers, and it was a wonderful session. Dr. Raziuddin.
So Rafat's question was whether we Muslims, when we talk about we the Muslim, when we say we Muslims should do this. So that is in fact is the ummah thing. Is that we Muslim a valid understanding? Who are we Muslim? I mean, a Muslim from Indonesia, a Muslim from Central Asia. Is this the individual Muslim or bulk of Muslim from one to other regions, they are thinking similarly? We Muslims, I mean, what does it mean? Do we here we Christians, or we this or that? So why the Muslims do this thing? We Muslims, what does this mean? Is this the sense of loose sense of ummah? Do we Muslims really are one?
You know, I don't know that that's a question for me to answer. I mean, that's a question that Muslims themselves have to answer for themselves. And, you know, whatever the answer they find is the answer they find. I don't know that, by the way, that Muslims are unique in having a global identity as Muslims. I think you see there are other religious groups that have the same identity, despite the fact that you have also the diversity within those religious groups. But for Muslims to define what we Muslims means, it's for Muslims to define.
Yeah. So why I said that word, let me go a little bit and then maybe Professor.
I think Muhammad may have something to add there.
Yeah, Professor Fadel can extrapolate more. What I meant was, you go to a mosque. I'm putting a real scenario, case scenario. You go to a mosque. It is always in America or elsewhere in Europe. It's a very international scenario. Everybody stands side to side, side by side, and prays. The moment you come out of that mosque, you will see bulk of people making one group, an Iranian or an Egyptian or a Pakistani Indian or somebody else. So to me, the real case scenario is not inside the mosque because you're standing before God. So it's all common. But outside the mosque is what the mini ummas are, where a group finding similar interest, similar language, similar issues, forms a group. And is that, Professor Fadel, that I mean, just thinking loudly?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I would say is we all have multiple identities.
Good.
And you know, we have religious identities, we have ethnic identities, we have national identities, we have cultural identities, we have intellectual identities, and we all prioritize those different identities in different ways. So, and again, that's something which I think is, you know, that groups choose for themselves, that individuals choose for themselves. And I'm not sure that there are rights or wrongs here.
That's a good answer. Yes, Professor Fadel.
Yeah, I think, you know, just echoing on what James was saying, the word ummah is used in many, many, many different ways, even in the Quran. So in one sense, all of humanity is one ummah in the Quran. And so you always have to recognize that the term ummah, as we say, is multivalent. It has many, many different meanings, right? So there's a religious conception to it. There's a social conception to it. There's also a legal conception to it. So what did it mean in the pre-modern era from a legal perspective that Muslims were part of one ummah? So I'm a lawyer. I'll tell you what it meant. So what it meant, for example, was that if there were a legal judgment from a Muslim judge in what is today Indonesia, right? That could potentially be enforceable anywhere in the Muslim world, because from a legal perspective, all of these different judges were part of what we would call a coordinate jurisdiction. So they might have had separate rulers in terms of like kings, so to speak, or sultans or emirs, whatever you want to call them. But from a legal perspective, they worked together within a common legal order, right? Sort of like you could say like the EU or something like that, okay? What the modern nation state does is it claims to have absolute sovereignty over its own territory. So that claim is very incommensurate with classical Islamic political thought. Islamic political thought does not require a unitary state as such. It's perfectly comfortable with having a plurality of states. What is a source of tension is the claim of absolute sovereignty of these states. Because when you have absolute sovereignty, then you're no longer restrained by law. And so this is where the real tension is, right? It's not having a plurality of states. That's been a part of Muslim history since the 2nd century, right? The issue is, do they all view themselves as being subject to a common set of laws, right? But if they view themselves as sort of above the law, the sovereign can do no wrong, I can do whatever I want to my people because I'm a sovereign, right? Then that is a very incompatible conception with Islam, right? And, you know, and then sort of on the vertical sense is that if you are a Muslim in Morocco or Egypt or Indonesia, the legal rights that you have are portable, sort of in this vertical sort of commonwealth, right? So there's certain sort of freedom of movement, freedom of, you know, et cetera, mutual recognition of legal judgments. There's all sorts of legal content to the idea of ummah that has nothing to do with subjective feelings, right? And that, of course, disappears with the rise of nation states because nation states are so jealous of their sovereignty, right? So anyway, I will just one last thing. Is it a viable concept in the modern world to notice, or some sort of political concept of the ummah? What I would say is the following. One of the classes I teach is international business transactions, right? Now, if you look at the political economy of the world today, the world is being broken up or divided into very large trading blocks. You have North America, you have Europe, you have East Asia. And even though this is contrary to the spirit of the post-World War II economic settlement in Bretton Woods, which is supposed to be liberalized trade for everybody, most favored nation, et cetera, the fact is, if you are not part of a trading group, you have no future. And as it turns out, a very large portion of the global South is not part of any kind of large trading group, which has really dramatic impacts on their ability to prosper in the modern economy. It happens to be that a very large percentage of those states happen to be Muslim states, right? So as a matter of survival, these states need to develop some sort of way of promoting greater and greater integration. So the political idea of ummah is still, in my opinion, extremely viable, extremely necessary as a development strategy. Anyway.
Razi Bhai, it is a long hours and he should be very late for Dr.
I was
Professor Dorsey.
Yeah, about to say this.
That's fine.
Yeah, so okay, this is over 2 hours, and so we must conclude now here and stop it. Thank you very much for the very, very engaging session, and we learned a lot, and still there is so much to learn. So thank you very much.
Before you close, Brother Raji, is it possible we could have informal chat after this close?
No, we cannot. It is
no informal chat.
Everybody is tired, this is too much.
From anybody else.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you both.
Okay. So the speakers are excused. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mohammed, thanks. Raz, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Amir Bhai, did you raise hand again or I just...
Okay, that was part of what Professor James has said, and just wanted to raise at one point, but it's not worth taking his time now at this late hour. So,
No, I'm happy. I'm happy to respond.
Well, it's very nice.
If Raz is okay with that.
Yeah, of course.
One thing I wanted to say, if I'm allowed to, that nobody raised the question that the part of the problem we be having in the Muslim Arab world is the lack of freedom of expression and thought. This is how things thrive. You may have all the money and all that.
Absolutely.
And I think Egyptians and Pakistani too, Indians are very talented people, and you can see when they come out of the country, they did excellent. I mean, in terms of innovation. The problem is they don't have the freedom of thought and expression. Or this is how you thrive. Now, when Mamun Rashid in the 8th century established the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, he gave perfect freedom to the people and they were drawn from all parts of the religion, all parts of the country, Hindus, and Arabs, and all Persians, and all that. And this is how I think the whole thing thrived. And I think gradually now the autocracy and in the Muslim world, this has become a very scarce commodity. So
no, I fully agree with you. And in fact, that was what I was referring to when I was talking about Singapore and the investment in its human capital. You need freedom of expression. You need freedom of the press. And you don't have that. If anything, and again, this goes back to what I call this battle of the soul of Islam. Leave aside now the terminology of it. If anything, that battle has caused deterioration in the ability to freely express oneself. Just bear with me a second because I think my battery is about to go down. Just bear with me a minute. Okay. I think I'm back. Should be okay. Hi.
So I think you are absolutely right. I think this is something which we have lost over several centuries, and some multiple reasons for it. And I think we suffer largely because of that one particular lack of freedom.
Well, I mean, that's the argument, and I would encourage you to read his book, that Ahmed Kuru work. I mean, Ahmed Kuru basically describes the situation in the initial centuries up until the 10th, 11th century of Islam, in which religious scholars were independent of the state. They often were merchants, or they were funded by merchants. And it's sort of in the 10th, 11th century that you get the militarization of the state and the subjugation of the religious scholars. And that's essentially also, except for you get the revival in Baghdad and so on, of course. But after that militarization and that fundamental structure of state and religion is what you see today in much of the Muslim world.
Well, in Pakistan, I see there is such a strict concern about the textbooks and taught to the students in university and others that the teachers are really scared of what they can or cannot say, because blasphemy and all kind of things are against them, and they have to walk through a very narrow path, worrying because if some religious person brings that fatwa that this is blasphemy, they are doomed, whether you are innocent or you are guilty.
No, I've spent a lot of time in Pakistan. I've seen it.
Oh, I hope that was a better time.
Until very recently, not always a better time.
Okay.
But going back to the late 70s and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and all of that. So I'm fully aware of it. But you should read Ahmed's book. It's well worth it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Okay, well, I'll bid you farewell. Thank you very much and wish you all the best.
Thank you. We enjoyed your talk and your
Thank you.
enlightenment.
And hopefully we meet again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank
And
you.
also- Okay, that ends the session.